Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know the kinds of stories we tell here. You know the ones. The guy who met a girl on Filipino Cupid and sent her money for 18 months before he ever stepped off a plane. The retired soldier who put his pension into a beach resort that somehow, mysteriously, was never quite finished. We've told those stories, and we'll tell more of them. But today's story is different, and I want you to pay attention to that because the difference is the whole point. This one's about a man named Harley, 57 years old when this starts. New Jersey, 24 years driving buses for NJ Transit. Not exactly the profile you picture when someone says expat disaster in Southeast Asia. Harley didn't go looking for a young girlfriend and didn't go looking for adventure. He went looking for somewhere he could afford to breathe after the worst year of his life. He did his research. He read the forums, watched the YouTube channels, understood the visa requirements. He went in with his eyes open. And 3 years later, he was living in conditions that shocked the people who knew him, with most of his money gone and no clear way home. I'll let him tell it. Here's his story, in his own words. I drove the same route for 24 years, Route 168, Paramus to Port Authority, down through Ridgewood, onto the Turnpike extension, into the Lincoln Tunnel, and you come out the other side into Midtown Manhattan and drop people off and turn around and do the whole thing again. 5 days a week, sometimes 6, when someone called out sick and dispatch called me. I knew every pothole. I knew which section of the turnpike got bad around November when the ground shifted. I knew the regulars. The woman who got on at Ridgewood Avenue every morning with the same green travel mug. The guy in the red jacket who always fell asleep and almost missed his stop. The dispatcher named Phil, who had the same 3 complaints he rotated through on the radio. I didn't need to think. That was the thing about the job. Once you know the route, you don't think. Your hands know what to do. You just drive. And then I'd come home and Diane would be there, or I'd get there before her and start the coffee. And we had our thing. 28 years of our thing. She worked the front desk at a pediatric clinic in Hackensack. Days. I drove nights. We met in the driveway at 7 in the morning, her coming home, me getting home, and we'd sit out there with coffee even in winter sometimes, just for a few minutes. It sounds like nothing. It was everything. She was 54. February, a Tuesday. I was asleep. I worked nights, remember? And she was making breakfast. And there was a sound. I don't know how to describe the sound. And then nothing. No warning. Nothing wrong with her heart that anyone knew about. That's the part people keep wanting me to explain, like there must have been signs. There weren't. She was fine on Monday. Monday evening we talked about whether to repaint the bathroom, and Tuesday morning she was gone. The union gave me bereavement leave. My daughter Lauren flew up from Charlotte. People from the neighborhood brought food. There was so much lasagna in that house I couldn't look at lasagna for a year afterward. Lauren stayed 2 weeks, and then she had to get back to her kids, and my brother-in-law Gary came by on weekends for a while. And then it was just me. I went back to work after 6 weeks because I didn't know what else to do with myself. And the route was the same. Every pothole in the same place. Every regular with their coffee. And I drove it and I thought, this is all there is now. This exact thing, every day, until I retire. And then what? I lasted 8 months in that house. I want to be clear about that. I tried. I tried to be a person who stays and deals with it, and gets through it the way people are supposed to. I painted the bathroom. I threw out her clothes, most of them, because Lauren said it would help. I don't know if it helped. But the kitchen, I couldn't fix the kitchen. I'd just stand there and I could feel where it happened. The floor. I'd cook something, and the whole time I'd be standing 2 feet from that spot, and eventually I stopped cooking and started getting sandwiches from the place on Bergen. I sold the house in October. Walked away with $162,000 after what was left on the mortgage. Moved my tools into a storage unit on Route 17 and put 2 bags in my brother-in-law Gary's spare room in Teaneck. 57 years old with 2 bags in someone else's house. Gary and his wife Patrice were good about it. They didn't make me feel like a burden, or they tried not to. But there's only so long you can sit in someone else's living room watching their television before you start to feel like furniture nobody knows what to do with. And I started spending evenings on my laptop just to have somewhere to look that wasn't their walls. That's how I found the group. Retire in the Philippines, The Real Truth. That was the name of it. 14,000 members. I don't remember what I searched for that brought it up. Probably something like Retire Abroad Cheap or Best Countries for American Retirees. One of those. And there it was. The pictures were what got me first. Sunsets over water. Plates of food, real food, rice and meat and vegetables, with captions saying things like, dinner for 2, $6. Guys sitting on plastic chairs outside little restaurants with San Miguel beers, grinning like men who'd been let out of something. And I want to tell you about who these guys were, because this is important. These weren't rich guys. And these weren't the kind of people who retire to Tuscany and drink wine and write memoirs. These were postal workers, retired cops from Ohio and Pennsylvania, a few Army guys. One guy had driven school buses in Massachusetts for 30 years. My people. Working people who'd put in the time and were looking for somewhere their money made sense. I started reading every post, every thread. The ones about cost of living, and the ones about the visa requirements, and the ones where guys argued about which city was better, Cebu or Davao, and the ones where people posted their monthly budgets, $1,200 a month, $1,400 a month, including rent and food and everything. I did the math on my Social Security. I'd be eligible at 62, so that was 5 years off. But I had the $162,000 from the house, and if I was careful, that was enough of a runway. Possibly enough to get all the way to Social Security, if I lived simply. I looked at Thailand for about a week, Vietnam for a few days, but the Philippines kept pulling me back, and I think I know why. English is everywhere there. Official language, more or less. And it's a Catholic country, heavily. And that felt familiar in some way I couldn't quite put a name to. Not that I'm particularly religious, but there's something about a culture built around family and church and obligation that rhymes with how I grew up in New Jersey, Italian and Irish neighbors, everybody in everybody's business, grandmothers who fed you whether you were hungry or not. I watched maybe a dozen YouTube channels. I looked up the SRRV visa, that's the Special Resident Retirees Visa, and I understood what the deposit requirement was, the income requirements, the whole structure. I felt prepared. I felt like a man who had done the reading. I called Lauren in February and told her I was thinking about going to Cebu. She was quiet for a second. Not a panicked quiet. More like she was choosing her words. She said, "Okay, Dad. For how long?" I said I wasn't sure yet. Maybe a few months. See how it felt. She said, "Okay." She said to be careful. She said to call her when I landed. I booked a one-way ticket for March. Figured I'd buy the return whenever I needed it. The flight from Newark goes through a hub, lands in Cebu at night, and when they open the door of the plane, the heat just walks in and introduces itself. Not like summer in Jersey. A different thing entirely. Wet and warm and permanent. And I stood in the immigration line at Mactan Airport with my 2 bags and thought, this is either the smartest thing I've ever done or the stupidest, and either way, I'm here. I found my condo in Lahug, mid-range building, mostly Filipino tenants, a couple of other foreigners, for 28,000 pesos a month. Did the math, roughly $500. I stood in the middle of that furnished room on the first night and thought about what $500 got you in Paramus. Not much. Not even close to this. 2 rooms, a little balcony, air conditioning that worked. The carinderia on the ground floor of the building sold rice and adobo, and this fish soup I didn't have a name for yet. And the first week I ate there every day because it was 50 pesos a meal, 90 cents, and it was good. I bought a second-hand scooter from a guy 1 floor up for 18,000 pesos. Learned to say salamat, which is thank you, because it seemed like the minimum. For about 6 weeks, it worked. It just worked. I'd get up in the morning and ride the scooter around and eat cheap and watch the city and think, this is manageable. This is a life I can manage. I didn't know yet what manageable was going to cost me. The building had a property manager named Bong. That's not a nickname. Well, it might be. A lot of Filipino names work that way. But that's what everyone called him. Bong. He was maybe 40, always in a polo shirt, always had a clipboard, and he knew everything about everyone in that building the way certain people just do. If your water pressure was low, you called Bong. If the neighbors were playing karaoke until 2 in the morning, and they did, they always did, it's not a stereotype, it's just Tuesday. You talked to Bong. I had a list of small things I needed sorted in my first month. A shower head that dripped. A ceiling light that flickered. So I knocked on Bong's office on the ground floor, and he fixed everything inside a week. And we got into the habit of talking when I passed by. He wanted to practice his English, I think, though his English was already fine. He asked me where I was from, what I did back home, why I came to Cebu and not Manila. I told him about the bus, about Diane. Not everything, but enough. Maravic was his cousin. I want to be clear about that because I've thought about it a lot since, whether it was a setup or whether it was just how things work here, where everyone's cousin knows everyone else's cousin and the whole city is 6 degrees of somebody's relative. I still don't know. Maybe Bong saw a lonely American and thought he was doing something kind. Maybe something else. I genuinely don't know. Oh, she came by the building one afternoon to drop something off for him. I was coming in off the scooter, helmet under my arm, and she was waiting by the elevator. We both waited. The elevator in that building was slow. We talked. Her name was Maravic, 44 years old. She'd lost her husband, his name was Danny, about 2 years before. Diabetes, then complications, then one complication too many. She worked as a bookkeeper for an export company out in the IT park on the edge of the city, the kind of modern office district that looks like it was lifted out of somewhere in Texas and dropped into Cebu. She was matter-of-fact about her life, the way people are when they've been through something and processed it and come out the other side still standing. That detail about the bookkeeping, I know how it sounds now, but at the time, on a bookkeeper, someone who manages other people's money professionally, someone whose entire job is being accurate and responsible with numbers, that felt like a signal. The thing I was looking for, without knowing I was looking for it. Proof that she was the kind of person who made careful decisions. She was not beautiful in the way that word usually gets used. She was pretty in a quiet way. With reading glasses, she kept pushing up her nose, and she had a way of listening to you where she seemed to actually be listening rather than waiting for her turn to talk. Diane was like that. I noticed it about Diane the first time we met, 29 years ago at a graduation party in Hackensack, the way she really listened. I don't know what to do with the fact that I noticed the same thing about Maravic. Make of it what you will. Well, we talked for maybe 15 minutes that first time. She said it was nice to meet me. She left. That was it. Bong mentioned her again the following week. Casually. Said she'd asked about the American widower on the 4th floor. I said she was welcome to have my number if she wanted to get coffee sometime. He gave it to her. She texted 2 days later. We got coffee at this place near the Ayala Center, one of those mall-adjacent cafes with good air conditioning and bad music. She ordered something iced. I had a black coffee. We talked for 2 hours, and it felt like 40 minutes. She knew the Philippines inside and out. The city, the provinces, the way things worked. And she was curious about America in a way that felt genuine rather than transactional. She wanted to know what New Jersey was actually like, not the TV version. I told her. She laughed at the right parts. 3 months. That's how long it took before I even held her hand. I want you to understand that, because every warning I'd read in those Facebook groups, every horror story on those YouTube channels, the pattern was always the same. Love bombing fast, declarations early, money requests within weeks. There was none of that. 3 months of coffee and occasional dinners at this Mang Inasal near her office. She always paid her own, always. She made a point of it. Before anything that resembled romance. By month 4, I was going out to Consolacion on Sundays. That's where her family's house was, 40 minutes by jeepney from the city. Out past the SM Consolacion Mall and into the residential barangays where the houses got smaller, and the basketball courts appeared every 100 meters, and there were roosters absolutely everywhere. Her mother's house was a solid concrete structure, 3 bedrooms, a little garden with a papaya tree. Modest, but not poor. Her mother went by Nanay Gloria, 71, small, with the same way of listening as Maravic, and she cooked like it was her profession. The first Sunday I went out there, she made kare-kare, oxtail and peanut sauce, which sounds strange and tastes remarkable. And there was rice and a pot of something I didn't catch the name of, and San Miguel in the refrigerator. The 2 younger brothers were there. Rodel, 28, who did delivery work on a motorcycle. Jun, 32, who did various things that were never quite clearly defined. Jun's wife, Precious. Their 2 kids, maybe 4 and 6 years old, who found it hilarious that I couldn't understand the cartoon they were watching. Rodel shook my hand and said it was nice to meet me. Jun shook my hand and said the same. Nanay Gloria said something in Cebuano, and Maravic translated, she said I looked like I needed feeding. They called me Kuya Harley. Kuya means older brother, roughly. Someone explained this to me that first Sunday, and I nodded and filed it away and didn't think much about it. But I'll tell you something. 57 years old, a man who'd just spent the better part of a year not knowing what to do with himself, sitting in a house full of people who seemed genuinely glad you came. That word, kuya, that lands somewhere. It doesn't feel like a word. It feels like a door opening. I kept checking the situation against the checklist I'd built in my head from all that research. No urgent requests, no dramatic stories about sick relatives in the first week, no pressure toward anything. The group had warned about a specific pattern, and this wasn't it. Maravic had a job. She had a normal life, normal problems, a family who laughed at the dinner table. I'd done the reading. I'd watched the channels. This was not that. I think about that a lot. The confidence I felt, the certainty that I'd been careful enough. I hadn't been careful at all, of course, but I didn't know that yet. What I knew was that when I rode the scooter back into Cebu on Sunday evenings with the night market smell of fish balls and diesel coming off the road, Well, I felt something I hadn't felt in over a year. I felt like somewhere was home. The first time money came up, it wasn't Maravic who brought it up. That matters to me. I've turned it over enough times that I'm sure of it. It was a Sunday in July, maybe the 6th or 7th time I'd been out to Consolacion. We were sitting in the yard after lunch. Nanay Gloria had made sinigang, pork and tamarind broth, the kind of thing that tastes like someone's been cooking it since morning, which she had, and Rodel was on the phone in the corner of the yard, looking tense in the way young guys look tense when they're trying not to show it. Maravic glanced at him a few times. Didn't say anything while we were eating. Later, on the jeepney back toward the city, she mentioned it. His motorcycle needed work. Something with the engine. Without the bike, he lost his delivery route. And without the route, he had no income. The repair was 15,000 pesos. She said it matter-of-factly, not as a request, more like someone mentioning a problem that existed in the world. I said I'd cover it. She started to say I didn't have to. I said I knew I didn't have to. 15,000 pesos was $270. I'd spent more than that on a set of snow tires back in Jersey without thinking about it twice. And here was a kid, not a kid, a 28-year-old man, but still, who was going to lose his livelihood over an engine repair. You help your neighbors. That's not complicated. That's just how I was raised. Maravic was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." That was it. I didn't track it against anything. Didn't write it down. It was a stand-alone thing, done and filed away. The next one came in October. Nanay Gloria's eyes had been getting worse for months. She had cataracts in both eyes, and the public hospital in Cebu had her on a waiting list that Maravic said was running close to 6 months, sometimes longer. The private clinic at Chonghua Hospital could do the surgery in 2 weeks. The difference in cost was 45,000 pesos, about $810. I said yes before Maravic finished explaining it. I'd watched Nanay Gloria squint at things. I'd seen her hold her phone 6 inches from her face to read a message. A 6-month wait for a 2-week fix that I could afford without blinking. I don't know what I would have been saying no to, exactly. Pride? Whose? We took her to the clinic together. I sat in the waiting room with Maravic for 3 hours, reading a magazine I couldn't concentrate on. When Nanay Gloria came out with a patch over one eye, she held my hand and said something in Cebuano, and Maravic translated again. She said I was a good man. She said it like it was a simple fact, the way you'd say the weather is hot or the rice is done. I believed her. That's the thing. I believed I was a good man doing good things. And that's not entirely wrong. And that's exactly the problem. The roof came next. November, before the heavy rains. Maravic showed me the damage. A section of the Consolation house had been patched and repatched over the years, and the last typhoon season had opened up a spot above the second bedroom that let water in when it rained hard. She'd gotten a quote from a contractor. The same guy Bong had recommended for something in my building the previous month, so I felt like I had a reference. 80,000 pesos, about $1,440. I went and looked at the roof myself. I'm not a roofer, but I've worked around construction guys my whole career, and I can tell when something genuinely needs fixing. It genuinely needed fixing. I paid it. And then, in June, his idea was a sari-sari store. You see them everywhere in the barangays. Little shops built into the front of someone's house, a window cut in the wall, wire shelves with chips and soap and instant noodles, and cold drinks if you've got a refrigerator. John had the space, a covered area at the side of his mother's house that wasn't being used for anything. What he needed was stock and a refrigeration unit for drinks. The estimate was 120,000 pesos, which worked out to about $2,150. He walked me through the numbers himself, careful and specific, showing me what margin he'd make on cold drinks versus dry goods. He'd done the math. I appreciated that he'd done the math, so I paid that too. Now I want to stop here and tell you what this looked like from the inside, because from the inside, it didn't look like anything except normal. Each thing was its own thing: a motorcycle repair, a medical procedure, a roof, a small business. Between October and January, that was $270 plus $810 plus $1,440 plus $2,150. Call it $4,670 in family support over 6 months. For context, I was spending about $1,800 a month on rent and food and transport and the SRRV application fees. So the family money on top of that was substantial, but not staggering. I had $162,000 when I landed. I'd put $20,000 into the SRRV deposit, locked in a Philippine retirement account at the PNB branch in Cebu. Inaccessible. That's just how it works. And I had about $125,000 of liquid money left. Running the numbers in my head, I felt fine. Tighter than I'd planned, but fine. And besides, when I added it all up against a year in Jersey, I was still coming out ahead. That's a sentence I said to myself probably 40 times over those months. Still cheaper than New Jersey. I should have written it on a wall somewhere so I could see how stupid it looked. But I didn't. There was an Australian guy I sometimes ran into at a coffee shop on Fuente Osmeña. Older than me, been in Cebu about 4 years. The kind of expat who's friendly, but has the careful eyes of someone who's learned things the hard way. One afternoon in December, he sat down at my table uninvited, and we talked for a while, and he said, almost as an aside, that family obligations in the Philippines add up fast. Said it quietly, without elaboration, the way you'd warn someone about a wet floor. I said, yeah, I'd read about that in the groups. He nodded and changed the subject. I think about that conversation sometimes. He wasn't vague, and he was telling me something directly. I just didn't hear it as being about me, because in my head, what I was doing was different from what those other guys in the horror stories did. I wasn't being manipulated. I was choosing to help people who needed help. That distinction felt important. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. By the end of year 1, I'd spent about $22,000 beyond my living costs. And I still had my savings. And I still had my plan. And I still had Maravic, who was warm and steady and had never once asked me for a single thing. Lauren called more in those months, asked about my finances in ways she tried to make sound casual. I told her I was fine. I told her the math still worked. She said, "Okay, Dad," and I could hear the thing she wasn't saying, and I just drove past it the way you drive past a sign on the highway that you're not sure you read right. By the time you think about turning back, you're already 3 exits past it. The move out of the condo was Maravic's idea, and I agreed to it within about 10 minutes of her bringing it up. Her reasoning made sense. Nana Gloria's blood pressure had been giving her trouble since the cataract surgery, and the local clinic in Consolacion was saying she needed more regular monitoring than the family could easily manage when she was living 40 minutes from everyone. The condo in La Hogue was costing 28,000 pesos a month. She'd found a house to rent in Consolacion. Proper house, not a room, a full house with a yard. For 18,000 pesos. That's a saving of $180 a month. The numbers were right there. Be what I didn't run the numbers on, I was breaking my lease 3 months early. The penalty was 20,000 pesos, about $360. I was giving up the only private space I'd had in a year and a half. My 2 rooms, my balcony, my air conditioning that worked reliably. And I was moving into a house that already contained Maravic, Nanay Gloria, Rodel, June, Precious, and 2 children under 7. 7 people. 1 bathroom. But I told myself what I'd been telling myself for months. This is how Filipino families live. I'd read it in the group posts. I'd heard it from guys who'd been here longer than me. Extended family, multi-generational households, everybody under one roof. That's normal here. That's culture. You don't show up in someone else's country and demand a setup that only makes sense where you come from. So I packed my 2 bags, same 2 bags I'd brought from Gary's spare room in Teaneck, which strikes me now as a detail worth sitting with, paid the lease penalty, and moved to Consolation in February of year 2. The house was fine. Concrete walls, tile floors, a little garden in the back where Nanay Gloria grew some herbs. My bedroom had a ceiling fan that worked most of the time, and a window that looked out on the neighbor's fence, and, beyond that, the upper half of a basketball hoop. There was always a basketball game happening somewhere nearby. Always. 7 in the morning, 10 at night, it didn't matter. I had a routine again, which was the thing I'd been chasing since before I ever found that Facebook group. Up early, down to the wet market with Maravic before it got too hot, back for breakfast, a scooter ride in the morning if I had somewhere to go, lunch at home, afternoons slow. Evenings watching Filipino TV I couldn't follow. I understood maybe 1 word in 10 of Cebuano, and I'd only picked up scattered Tagalog, so most of what came out of that television was noise, with an emotional register I had to guess at from context. Maravic would translate the important parts sometimes. Mostly, I just sat with it. She was still warm. I want to be accurate about that. She cooked for me. When my blood pressure spiked one afternoon, I've had borderline hypertension for years, nothing serious, but it flared up and I felt it. She drove me to the local clinic on the back of Rodel's motorcycle because the scooter was having a tire issue. She sat with me while the nurse took readings and asked questions. She translated. She held my hand in the waiting room. When we got home, she made me lugo, rice porridge, the way Filipinos make it for people who are sick or tired, and she didn't make a thing of it. What she didn't do, not once, across all of year 2 in that house, was tell her family no on my behalf. When Rodel needed something, the question came to me through Maravic. When June had a problem at the sari-sari store, same channel. When Nanay Gloria needed a follow-up at the hospital, and the jeepney fare and the clinic fee added up to 2,500 pesos for the day, Maravic mentioned it, and I covered it. Each thing small enough, each thing reasonable. I was somewhere around $85,000 in liquid savings by March of year 2, down from the $125,000 I'd had after the SRRV deposit. The rate of spending was faster than my original plan. But I kept recalculating and telling myself I was 3 years from Social Security. That was the goal line. Get to 62, get the monthly income, and everything stabilizes. The house idea came up in May. We were sitting on the back step after dinner. Me and Maravic. Warm night. The smell of something frying from the neighbor's window. And she mentioned that her mother owned a parcel of land, Barangay Pitogo, about 20 minutes further out from Consolation, toward the hills. It had been in the family for years, paid for, titled. She showed me the papers a few days later. Official-looking documents, stamps, the works. I couldn't read them, but the format looked right. If we built on it, she said, we'd stop paying rent. We'd have something permanent. 2 bedrooms, a proper bathroom for me, concrete construction. No more landlord. And Edmund, another cousin, this one on her mother's side, was a contractor. He'd done several houses in the area. He could give us a fair price. The estimate came in at 1.2 million pesos, about $21,600. Edmund's breakdown was specific: rebar and concrete for the structure, hollow blocks, roofing materials, labor, electrical, plumbing, permits. Harley's share, Maravic said, would be 1 million pesos, $18,000, and the family would contribute the remaining 200,000 pesos from savings Nanay Gloria had put aside. I understood I couldn't own the land. I'd known that before I got on the plane. Foreigners can't own land in the Philippines. It's in the law, full stop. The house would be Maravic's name. The land was the family's. And I was, what? A long-term partner, contributing to a shared life. A man who needed a bathroom he didn't share with 3 other people, and a bedroom with decent air circulation. I told myself it was an investment in stability. I transferred the $18,000. Construction started in June. I went out to the site twice a month. The footings went in. The walls started going up, hollow block by hollow block, slow and real and physical. Edmund walked me around with the confidence of a man who'd done this 100 times, pointing at things and explaining in accented English what each stage meant and when it would be finished. October, he said. November, at the latest. By August, the walls were at window height, and the pace had slowed. Edmund said it was the rainy season. Hard to pour concrete in the rain, hard to cure it properly. Made sense. By September, he was saying the cost of rebar had gone up since the estimate. A supplier problem, he needed another 220,000 pesos. About $4,000. I sent it. October, the roof trusses were partially in place, and Edmund said the permits were requiring a facilitation fee that he hadn't anticipated. 45,000 pesos. $800. I sent that too. November, the house was roughly 70% complete. Walls up, partial roof, rough electrical stubbed in, the bones of something real. And then Edmund stopped being reachable. Maravic called him. He answered twice, said he was dealing with a materials delay, would be back on site next week. Then he stopped answering. I stood at that construction site in December and looked at what I had. Walls, an incomplete roof, a concrete floor that wasn't yet sealed, a structure that wasn't legally mine, on land I had no claim to, in a country where I'd have no legal recourse if things went wrong, which was starting to feel like a distinct possibility. I told myself Edmund was probably just dealing with another job. I told myself the family wouldn't do this. I told myself I'd been here 2 years, and I knew these people. But at night, in the Consolation House, sharing one bathroom with 6 other people, lying under the ceiling fan and listening to the roosters start up at 4 in the morning, I noticed for the first time that there was no route home from where I was. On the bus, there was always a depot, always an end point. You turned around and you went back. I didn't know where back was anymore. By January of year 3, my savings were under $60,000 liquid. The SRRV deposit, $20,000, was sitting in a PNB account I couldn't touch for the duration of my residency status, which was itself in limbo because of a document problem that had been going on for 4 months. Here's how the SRRV works. You apply, you make the deposit, and they process your residency. The part of the processing requires a certificate from your home country, verifying you have no criminal record. The Bureau of Immigration had requested mine from New Jersey 3 times. 3 times the paperwork had gone somewhere into the gap between 2 government systems that don't talk to each other efficiently, and 3 times I'd had to start over. While that played out, I was on tourist visa extensions. 2,000 pesos every 2 months at the immigration office on Magallanes Street in Cebu City, plus the trip itself, plus whatever grab fare or bus fare it took to get there and back. About $200 every 2 months, just to stay legally in the country. I want you to understand the feeling of that. 24 years on a bus, I always knew exactly where I was on the route. I always knew how far to the next stop, how far to the depot, how far home. By January of year 3, I was a man who had spent $23,000 on a house he couldn't own, on land he had no legal claim to, with a contractor who'd stopped returning calls, on a visa that was stuck in bureaucratic mud, with $60,000 left and no income until 62. I had no exit ramp that I could see. The unraveling didn't come from one thing. I want to be clear about that. It was more like the way a bus engine starts to go. Not a single dramatic failure, just a sequence of smaller things, each one explainable on its own, until you're on the shoulder of the turnpike wondering how long it's been making that noise. The Sari Sari store was the first thing I really looked at. John had been running it for close to a year. I'd been by a dozen times, bought cold drinks, exchanged pleasantries. See, but in January, I started actually looking at the shelves instead of just visiting. They were sparse. The refrigerator had maybe a third of what it had when we stocked it. When I mentioned it to Maravic, she said John had been having trouble with his supplier, that he was working on it. I asked what the store's monthly income was. She said she'd have to ask him. She never came back to me with a number. Then the construction discrepancy. Edmund had told me the rebar shortage was a province-wide problem. Supplier issues, prices up 30%. So I did something I should have done 6 months earlier. I asked around. There was a hardware store near the SM Consolation that had a guy at the counter who spoke decent English and was used to dealing with foreigners doing home builds. I asked him about rebar prices. He said prices had gone up. See, sure, maybe 8% over the past year, not 30. I didn't say anything to Maravic about that, not yet. I started writing things down. A list, not dramatic, just facts in a notebook I kept in my bag. Money in, money out, dates, amounts. I'd been tracking my spending for years on the bus. Mileage logs, maintenance schedules, route times. So the habit was there. When I actually put it all in one place for the first time, the number came to about $76,000 spent over 22 months. Living costs, family support, construction, visa fees, the lease penalty, all of it. That left me with roughly $46,000 liquid, plus the $20,000 locked in the SRRV account I couldn't access. I was not fine. I was in Cebu City in late January for another immigration appointment when I ran into Tom. I barely remembered him. And he'd been at the condo building in La Hague briefly, maybe 3 months before he moved somewhere else. A retired firefighter from somewhere in Connecticut, Waterbury, I think, who'd been in the Philippines about 4 years and had the settled, cautious manner of a man who'd made his mistakes and learned to stay still. We'd had coffee twice, maybe 3 times. He was the kind of expat who listened more than he talked. I ran into him at the Mercury Drug on Colin Street. He was buying something. I was killing time before my appointment. We talked on the sidewalk for about 20 minutes. He asked how things were going in Consolation. I said, okay, more or less. He nodded in a way that suggested he already knew it wasn't exactly okay. Then he said, and I want to be precise about how he said it, and because it matters. He said he'd seen a name come up in a private group he was in, a closed Facebook group, expats who'd been in Cebu long enough to have figured some things out. They kept what he called a list, not a public thing, just names that had come up more than once in connection with money problems. He said Maravic's full name, quietly, the way you'd tell someone their fly was down. Not dramatic, just information. He said she'd been connected with 2 previous men, as far as the group knew. One British, sometime around 2015 to 2017. One Australian, 2018 to 2020. Both had given money to the family. Both had been connected to construction projects on family land. He said he'd heard the land in Barangay Pitago. That's her mother's land. I'd told him about the house at some point. Had an existing mortgage on it that predated everything. He said he was sorry. He seemed like he meant it. I stood on Colin Street in the heat with traffic going past, and a woman selling fish balls out of a cart on the corner, and I just processed it. Not fast. I'm not a fast processor. I drive at the speed of traffic, and I wait for things to make sense. Tom said if I wanted he could connect me to someone in the group who might know more. I said I'd let him know. We shook hands. He walked one way, I walked the other, and I went to my immigration appointment and sat in a plastic chair for 40 minutes, thinking about rebar prices and a sorry store with empty shelves. I went back to Consolation that evening and didn't say anything. And for a week, I lived in that house and ate dinner at that table and watched television I couldn't understand. And I ran down everything I could run down. I found a Filipino lawyer, not cheap, 5,000 pesos for an hour. Through a contact of an expat I'd met at a restaurant near the immigration office. I described the land situation without using names. He asked if I'd seen the title. I said I'd seen papers. He asked if I'd had a lawyer review them. I said no. He said that title papers can look legitimate and still carry encumbrances, liens, mortgages, family disputes, that wouldn't be obvious to someone who couldn't read the documents. He said the only way to know for certain was to run a title check at the Registry of Deeds. I gave him the barangay location and the family name and 3,500 pesos to do the check. He called me 4 days later. On the land had a mortgage registered against it. The creditor was a rural cooperative. The mortgage was nearly a decade old and only partially paid down. I called Lauren that evening from the bedroom while Maravic was cooking dinner. I could hear the rice cooker and the sound of something in a pan, and the muffled noise of the kids' cartoon from the living room. Lauren answered on the second ring. I told her I needed to come home. She didn't ask why right away. She just said, "Okay, Dad." She said she'd look at flights. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the ceiling fan going around and thought about the house out in Barangay Pitogo. Walls up, partial roof, 70% done and going nowhere. I thought about the British guy, the Australian. How many years between them and me? Whether any of us had felt, and at some particular Sunday lunch with kare-kare and San Miguel in the refrigerator, like we'd finally found the right place to put our weight down. Probably all of us had. That was the thing I kept coming back to. The morning I told her, she was making garlic rice. That specific smell, rice and garlic in oil, the way it hits before you're even fully awake, I'll always connect it to that day now. She had her back to me at the stove. The 2 kids were already at the neighbors. Jun had left early for something. The house was quieter than usual. I sat down at the table, and I didn't have a plan for what I was going to say. I'd driven buses for 24 years. You learn pretty fast that raising your voice at people who are stuck in a small space with you doesn't get you anywhere. So I just sat there and waited for her to turn around. And when she did, I said, "I'm going home." She stood there with the spatula. She looked at me for a long moment, the way she always looked at things. That listening quality. The same thing I'd noticed the first time we talked in the elevator lobby. Then she set the spatula down on the counter, and she cried. I want to be honest about this part. She cried, and I believe it was real. Or I believed that whatever was happening in her was real, even if the situation we were both in wasn't what I thought it was. She said the family needed me. She said that God had brought us together, that it was His plan for both of us, that she had never felt. And then her English got harder to follow through the crying, and I caught pieces of it. That she hadn't expected this, that she was sorry for whatever had gone wrong. I told her I believed she believed that. And I do. I think she probably does. But I'd done the title check, and I had the lawyer's call on my phone, which I'd listened to 3 times. The land carried a registered mortgage that was nearly 10 years old and had never been fully serviced. I had a notebook with $76,000 in outflows written down in my own handwriting. I had Tom's words from the sidewalk outside the Mercury Drug, delivered in the flat, apologetic tone of a man who knew there was no good way to deliver them. And I had the memory of the house out in Barangay Pitogo. Walls, partial roof, a concrete shell going nowhere, which I could not legally own, and which sat on land I had no claim to whatsoever. So I listened to her, and then I walked to the bedroom and called Lauren. She answered fast. I said I was ready to come home, that I needed a flight as soon as she could find one. She said she'd already been looking, that she'd had a feeling. I don't know if that made me feel better or worse. She booked me on a flight out of Mactan 3 days later, connecting through Manila into Newark. I spent those 3 days being very ordinary about everything. I ate at the table. I said good morning to Nanay Gloria. I watched television I couldn't follow. Maravic didn't push the conversation. That's a thing I've thought about too. She didn't argue, didn't escalate, didn't threaten. She went quiet the way the house went quiet. And maybe that's just who she is. Or maybe she'd seen this moment before with 2 other men, and she knew how it ended. I don't know. The day I left, Rodell loaded my 2 bags into a grab car without being asked. Just did it. He shook my hand. He said, "Take care, Kuya." I said, "You too." Now here's what I lost. Not approximately. Exactly. As close as I could calculate it. The SRRV deposit, $20,000. Locked in a PNB account until 6 months after the SRRV application was formally closed, which I had to do from the U.S. I eventually got that money back, minus fees and the time cost of 3 international phone calls and a notarized letter. Call it $19,200 recovered, 4 months later. Family support over 3 years. The motorcycle, the surgery, the roof, the sorry store. The smaller things I sometimes paid without noting them down. Approximately $22,000. Construction money, including the overruns and the facilitation fees. Approximately $23,000. Living costs across 36 months. Rent in Lahug, then Consolation, food, transport, the scooter purchase and maintenance, medical visits, the lease penalty, miscellaneous, approximately $31,000. Visa extensions, and the SRRV application fees, the lawyer, the title check, approximately $2,000. Total, $98,000. Give or take. I came back to the U.S. with $64,000. No property, no pension. I'd retired early to make this work, so Social Security was still years away, and a daughter who picked me up at Newark and said almost nothing on the drive back to Teaneck. She said, "I told you so" exactly once, quietly, somewhere on the Garden State Parkway, and then she didn't say it again. I'm in Gary's spare room again. Same room I left from. Different 2 bags. I drive for a medical transport company 2 days a week. Not the same as the bus. Different kind of quiet in those vehicles. but I don't mind the driving. I know how to drive. I think about Maravic sometimes. Not with bitterness, exactly. More like the way you think about a stretch of road you drove badly. You retrace it. You figure out where you made the wrong turns. You don't necessarily blame the road. She wasn't a monster. The family's need was real. The obligation was real. The love, or whatever it was between us, might have been real too. These things can coexist. I know that now. What I know for certain is this. I arrived in the Philippines broken. I arrived without a compass, without a schedule, without anyone to meet in the driveway at 7 in the morning. And I found a family that needed me, and I mistook being needed for being loved. Those are two different things. They can feel identical for a long time, but they're different. The Philippines didn't break me. Grief broke me before I ever got on the plane. The Philippines just had better weather. And now, just for a moment, let's step back from Harley's story. What you've just heard isn't the usual cautionary tale. There was no bar girl, no dating app, no one asking for money within the first week. Harley did his research. He knew the SRRV requirements. He understood foreigners can't own land. He watched for the patterns he'd been warned about, and he didn't see them because the pattern he encountered was slower, quieter, and wrapped in something that felt, and may genuinely have been, real warmth and real need. Here's what this channel has learned from stories like his. Filipino family obligation isn't always a scam. Utang na loob is a genuine cultural value, not a line in a script. Families genuinely support each other this way. A foreign partner is seen, culturally, as a blessing, a provider, like an OFW, who happened to stay. And that expectation isn't always manipulation. Sometimes it's just the culture, and sometimes it's both. The question Harley never got to answer, the question he's still sitting with in Gary's spare room in Teaneck, is whether he was ever really inside that family, or whether he was always on the outside funding it, looking in through a window that was always going to close when the money ran out. If you're watching this because you're planning your own retirement, your own fresh start, your own route out of something that stopped making sense back home, we're not here to tell you not to go. We're here to tell you to go with your eyes open, not just to the SRRV requirements, not just to the foreign land ownership laws, but to yourself, to what you're carrying when you get on that plane, to what you're actually looking for. And because the Philippines will give you warmth, it will give you family, it will give you somewhere to be on a Sunday. Whether any of it belongs to you is a different question entirely. Do your research. Know the laws. Have a lawyer look at the title before you transfer anything. Keep your own accounts, and maybe wait a year before you decide that what you've found is home. Thanks for watching Inside the Philippines. We'll see you in the next one.